Welcome to this special edition of Extreme Reloading. You know, last season we tried to answer the question of, does neck tension matter? And all of my results were really kind of inconclusive. What we did is a long, drawn-out testing ammo that I had crafted very, very carefully using federal premium brass. And I tried all different sorts of neck tensions down to around 1/1000th of an inch up to about 3/1000ths of an inch. I tried different techniques with a neck sizing die and then really special neck sizing dies with different bushings, like this Hornady match grade neck sizing die. We have 0.332, 333, 334, 335 bushings for this. We tried them all, and you know what? Nothing really stood out as this type of bushing, that level of neck tension really made a difference. And what I mean by really made a difference is I'm always looking at two parts of the results of our groups. One, of course, is the extreme spread measured in MOA. The other is the consistency of that ammo expressed in the standard deviation of those muzzle velocities. So the season kind of ended up in the air without a real definitive answer to that question of, does neck tension really matter? And so I didn't give up. What I have been doing in the off season is I have continued that test, but not continuing it with the exact same approach that I have been taking in the previous season. So what I have done is I have sort of retooled with the idea that, number one, I want to have my brass as consistent as possible. Now, that federal brass that I had been shooting last season has about 3 firings, maybe at this point 4 firings under it from the original factory to a couple of reloads over the years. And so some of you had suggested maybe that brass simply needs to be annealed and you'll see very different results. So I researched and studied that field of annealing, and what I did is I purchased the Annealeaz. Now, $275 isn't terribly expensive in comparison to some of the more expensive annealing machines that are out there, but of course that's not giving it away for free either. And what I have learned is, number one, annealing has to be done correctly. If a person does a shoddy job at annealing, you're probably going to make things worse. And what do I mean by make things worse? Well, what I'm driving for is highly precise, excellent ammunition. Now, the one thing very interesting about annealing is there seems to be no question out there whether annealing lengthens the lifespan of a piece of brass or not, and it certainly seems like annealing does do that. It prolongs the life of that brass, so that's very good. But there is another question out there that asks, does annealing make any difference at all? Does it improve the accuracy or precision of that ammunition? And it's very interesting that I found a dissertation that was done by Ryan Stevenson in the UK. And his advisor was an F-class shooter. So there was a lot of very, very neat things that were done in that study. They looked at the metal structure with electron scanning microscopes and X-ray microscopy, a whole bunch of very sophisticated ways of looking at that brass and looking at the results of annealing and neck turning and those sorts of things. And what they came up with, or Ryan Stevenson came up with at the end, is that it was, get a load of this, inconclusive about whether annealing really makes a difference in the precision of the ammunition. Now, I studied that dissertation pretty closely, And the annealing process that he used was pretty simple, mounting a shell holder on a power drill, turning it at a set speed, and then applying that flame to it. And one of his concerns that he brought up in that dissertation was that perhaps the annealing was not done as uniformly or as well as possible, and that a very good annealing process might change those results. But there's no guarantee in that. And what he's driving at, of course, and what I also learned by looking at some other things that have been published regarding annealing, is the fact that you need to achieve a high enough temperature on that mouth or neck and shoulder of that case, just into the shoulder there of that case, to actually anneal the brass. And what you have to do is you have to achieve about 750 degrees, a little bit over 750 degrees Fahrenheit. And a great way to do that, or to determine that, is to use something like this. This is Tempillac. You've probably seen this. And by applying some of this Tempillac to the area that we want to achieve 750 degrees, or a little bit over that, this tells us that that temperature was achieved because it darkens, it more or less burns at that temperature. So that is a more or less necessary instrument or necessary item if a person is going to be doing some serious annealing. And then I started thinking about, well, I also want to make sure that I don't anneal too far down that case, because what I don't want to have happen, and this could result in a sort of dangerous situation, is if I soften the head of the case. And so I purchased another bottle of Tempillac. This is the 450 degree Fahrenheit Tempillac. Sort of produces a gray color when the temperature is not met, and then of course darkens, blackens when we receive, or when it achieves 450 degrees on that brass. And I applied this down toward the head of the case and actually running up the body of the case. Now I set up my annealing machine, the Annealeaz, so that I would achieve a good annealing, 750 degrees Fahrenheit at the mouth, neck, and down into the shoulder, just a little bit past the shoulder, but I would not achieve anything close to 450 degrees down the body and anywhere near the head of that case. And so just a little bit of setup on the time spent by each piece of brass in the Annealeaz machine easily, actually pretty darn easily, allowed me to do that. One of the things I learned, though, is that these wheels don't like to have things on them. They have to be pretty clean. The brass has to be pretty darn clean for it to rotate correctly. Otherwise, when some of that, especially that 450 degree stuff down on the body, when that made contact with the wheels, it didn't want to turn, and so it just sat there in the flame, and that was not a good situation. Hey, you know, the smart thing to do on this is take some brass that's not your top of the line brass. I was using Hornady, a couple of other different brands of brass, and I was doing a lot of tests with that brass in the Annealeaz. I didn't take my top of the line ADT and Lapua brass and do that. The next thing that I looked at is the neck and how I was preparing that neck for these precision rounds. And the first thing that I did, and again thanks to some suggestions from you, was to look at the inside of the neck itself and to make sure that I was expanding that neck uniformly so that it would then take a very uniform external or outside diameter sizing. And what I did there is I purchased an expander body and a number of different expander mandrels, all from 21st century shooting. I have now a 308, 3075, and a 307 expander mandrel. And I actually have two of these bodies right now. This is their latest release of an expander body, and I couldn't resist to buy this one because it has this window. And so I can actually watch the mouth and the neck of that case as it is inserted, as I move that ram, and it is inserted into the expander body to make sure that I don't set it so that it bottoms out and starts, rounding over the actual mouth of the case itself. Good little innovation, and just came out maybe a couple months ago, and so I had to get one of these. So then I turned my attention back to neck turning, and I looked at some of my past neck turning results, and one little thing was bothering me, and that is that I could see these striations around the mouth, or rather the neck of a lot of those cases, which meant to me that I probably was rushing the neck turning job. And so I approached a new technique, or started using a new technique for my neck turning, and that is just number one, go very, very slow, and if necessary, take 2 passes instead of 1 pass on that brass. So I set up in this case I was experimenting with a large batch of some Hornady brass that I had, and I measured that brass with this Hornady gauge and the Sinclair neck measuring tool. What I found is that there was quite a bit of variability in those Hornady cases, and probably that is true of a lot of different head-stamped cases. And so I decided to take these down to about 15 thousandths, using some very, very careful, very slow work on the neck turning tool. I got those things down very, very nicely, and for those of you who mentioned it, I made sure that I was kissing the shoulder, as they say, and going a little bit farther on my neck turning, just to the point where we get into the neck and shoulder intersection right there. So I was very careful to make sure I was doing that, but remember, if you go too far, you're going to cut into that shoulder and then weaken that case. In fact, that was one of the things that was pointed out in Ryan Stevenson's dissertation, that can be a problem, exactly how a person turns those cases. But one thing that I noticed is that as I was measuring the thickness of those necks, I could actually, and this was bothering me for a while, if I just barely moved that case, I didn't have a very even pressure on that case itself as I was rotating it, I could easily move this dial a thousandth and a half, and it's not really moving here. It's just up and down there. So that bothered me. I wasn't convinced I was even getting very true and reliable readings. So to help make sure that I'm getting good measurements of neck thickness, I broke down and purchased one of these. This is a Mitutoyo vernier micrometer, and this is quite an instrument. I feel very confident by taking probably about 4, 5, or 6, about 4, let's say, readings off the neck of the case. Just move it, 4 times. That I will have a very repeatable and true measure of the thickness of the necks. And I think this is going to work out in the long run to be a good purchase for me as well. And since I'm working on these necks and the mouths and all that, I did one more thing. I went ahead and purchased this instrument, Wilson case trimmer, and I purchased this from Creedmoor Sports with the base made for it, and including this knockout plate right here. I went ahead and got the micrometer version so I can really control what's happening with the length of my cases, overall length of those cases. And of course, what I noticed with this one is, number one, it is really consistent. Excellent job by Ellie Wilson on this tool right here. The other thing is that the cases are trimmed very square. It's not a little bit high on one side, a little bit low on another. I'm not so sure that the previous technique that I was using did that. Maybe it did it a little bit, but this doesn't do it at all. So by using these tools, I feel very confident I've been able to improve the consistency of my brass cases once again. I mean, they were pretty much extremely consistent in the past, but I think I have probably kicked it up a notch. So let's talk about the results. Does all this make a difference? So as I like to say, the proof is in the pudding. Over the off season, I ended up firing 4 different groups, 4 different sessions, with 10 rounds being fired during each of those sessions. Well, 10 rounds being fired for a group. And here's what I did in every single one of these sessions. Number one, I was firing from 200 yards off of the bench. I dried the bore before coming out to the range, and I always shot at least 3 foulers through that bore, most of the time firing 5 foulers through the bore, based on kind of what I had in hand. Then, in some cases, I fired let's say, a standard set, nothing special at all, done with those necks and mouths. That's the Hornady brass again. And then also very, very similar Hornady brass that has, and this has all been weight sorted and carefully prepared on the primer pockets and all that good stuff. Very, very carefully loaded the powder charges into it, accurate to 1/10 of a grain. The bullets were seated using my Reading competition bullet seating die, so very, very consistent ammunition was produced. But as I was saying, sometimes I fired 2 of those instances. I fired the standard brass first, or the standard rounds, and then other 2 instances, the first rounds that I fired after the fouling and all that, was the very similarly produced but annealed and all that extra stuff being done to it, right? Okay, so now the results, there's very, very, very little difference between these two. Average MOA is only different by 1/10. And the standard deviation of those muzzle velocities was 13.6 feet per second for the standard prepared rounds versus 10.6 feet per second with the annealed, I'll call it the precision prepared rounds. Now, arguably, the most important thing to really look at is the group size on paper. That is probably the most important, maybe arguably most important proof in the pudding, right? Going back to that, I achieved an average of 1.5 MOA with the standard Hornady brass loading. I achieved 1.6 MOA with the precision Hornady brass loading. That's that difference in only 1/10 I noted earlier. And actually, the annealed precision prepared brass did slightly worse. But I would say statistically, they're not different at all. They are the same. But notice that those groups are big, 1.5, 1.6 MOA. That's nothing very impressive at all. In fact, this rifle, in one of my Fowler groups, 5-shot groups, I got a 0.6 MOA out of it, and then I started firing these. So it's almost like all this extra stuff I've been doing is doing nothing but messing up my groups. But here is really what I think is indeed happening. As I was turning those necks down to a 15 thousandths of an inch, I've been starting to look at the chamber of my Ruger precision rifle. And I think by measuring the outside diameter of those necks after firing, and some of the stuff I've been looking at when I'm trying to seat those bullets out a little ways so they make contact with the lands or with the lead area of that rifling, I effectively can't do that because that chamber is so generously reamed out or bored that there's no way I can pull that bullet out far enough to make contact with that rifling and still have any hopes of getting it to feed into the magazine. So all of these things together lead me to believe that that chamber is pretty generously cut. And so when I have trimmed those necks down to a 15,000th of an inch, what's happening when that round is fired is that there's a fair amount of space between the outside diameter of my brass and the inside of that chamber. And so in some cases it probably opens up very quickly and out goes the bullet. In other cases, other instances, it might hesitate just a little bit before the bullet is ejected out there. And I think what I'm getting is some rather erratic rounds. So my lesson here is this. I think that while neck turning can be useful and absolutely mandatory for some custom chambers, custom-made rifles, kind of some tight chambers, might be very, very important to do that. With these factory-made rifles, Ruger, other types of rifles are probably right in the same ballpark there, that the really precise turning of those necks, like I've been doing, might actually make things worse. I'm not saying don't turn the necks at all. I think the most important thing to do is to make those necks consistent, but do so only by taking down the real anomalies, right? So if you've got a really bad case, the most important thing to do is probably not even use that for your precise ammunition. Maybe just use it for your fowlers and your practices and so on and so forth. But certainly get it as close to possible to highly uniform brass neck thicknesses. But I don't think I'm going to be spending such tremendous amount of time on that because I'm not seeing the return on investment, if you will, in turning these cases down as far as I have been doing. So that's a good lesson learned. The other thing is I noticed that when I applied a very, very light neck tension, I tried to get her down to exactly 1,000. And, I had it right there. This was going to be a great thing. And I worked that ram, and I didn't feel much going on when I was seating those bullets. And I pulled it up. Something looked odd. So I grabbed a hold of that bullet, and I just lifted it right out. Okay? Not enough neck tension. And if there's not enough neck tension, you're certainly going to have some erratic ammunition. And so I did a little experiment with that, and it was just abysmal. You've got to have sufficient neck tension to hold that bullet into the case. What is sufficient? It's dependent upon your rifle. And this rifle right here looks like, 2 thousandths, maybe 2.5 thousandths, 3 thousandths, maybe, I don't think so, is what this one is liking. So it really shoots that Lapua brass really, really well. And I tend to have done nothing special with my Lapua brass. Case sorted, do a lot of work on those primers. That pays dividends, lots of return on investment there. But I'm going to avoid messing with the necks and such on these. What I am going to do is I will occasionally anneal. I'm not going to scrap this whatsoever because I do see the benefit to prolong the life of my wonderful Lapua brass. But I don't think I'm going to be doing much at all in the lines of turning down those necks and those sorts of things. One thing I will be doing in the not too distant future is I'm going to be making use of this Mitutoyo to find out what is so special about these Lapua brass cases as far as the necks are concerned. How consistent are those things? What is the neck thickness on those Lapua brass that's given me such very, very consistent rounds and very, very consistent groups? Well, we're going to be starting up a brand new season of extreme reloading here in just a little while. And this new season coming up, we'll be taking advantage of some of this new equipment, but I'm going to be focusing on bullets. I'm going to be asking the question, I can buy and I can use a score of different 168 grain bullets in my Ruger Precision Rifle 308 Winchester. I can use a score of different 69, 70 grain bullets in my 5.56 and 2.23. How come some of those shoot far better than others? Well, we always have heard that this barrel simply likes the Sierra tipped Match King, and that one simply likes the Barnes Match Burner or whatever. I'm sure you've heard something just like that. But why does that rifle really shoot better with that Barnes bullet or with that Sierra bullet? So we're going to be digging way into the bullets, looking at the shape of those bullets, going to be doing some bullet sorting. Hey, lots of cool stuff. See if we can get to the bottom of this on the next season of Extreme Reloading. Thanks for watching.